Hi, I'm Steve Sabludowsky, publisher of Bayoubuzz.com, and today we're going to be talking about the Louisiana Governor's Race. We have Jim Brown and Michael Henderson. I've asked both of them to introduce themselves. Michael, starting with you, Dr. Michael Henderson.
Sure, I'm Mike Henderson. I am the research director of the Public Policy Research Lab at LSU. It's a survey research center, and we do some polling. And I'm also an assistant professor in the Manship School of Mass Communication. And my research background is in political science, polling, public opinion, campaigns, and elections.
Okay, and Jim.
Well, Steve, since we're talking about governor's races, I'm probably the only media guy that works with you who's ever run for governor. I ran for governor in 1987. I was Secretary of State, Insurance Commissioner, State Senator. So I'm a has-been politician. I write a column at JimBrownUSA.com, do a national radio show, and I have the great pleasure of working with you doing these hangouts on regular occasions. And the governor's race is right here and now, so we've got lots to talk about today.
Absolutely. So, why don't you tell us about the poll, just in general, if you could just give us a snapshot in terms of what the results were.
Sure. The main thing, I think the main takeaway we found is most voters aren't paying attention yet. Most voters don't know much about 3 of the 4 major candidates. Most voters say they're not paying attention to the news about the campaign. And the opinions that they offer on favorable, unfavorable on the major candidates really haven't budged in our survey from when we last asked in March.
Well, that means we can all go home.
That's right.
We have nothing to do. Jim, I'm sure you have a number of questions. Go ahead.
Well, we'll get into the nuance of the poll, but I guess, Michael, were you surprised at the lack of interest? I've got a theory as to why your numbers came out like they did, and I agree with your 100%. Did you guys do any probing in terms of why, outside of Vitter, there's very little name recognition and no real sense of what these guys do, no really strong favorability at this stage? You just think it's my thoughts are no money's being spent yet until you start spending the really big bucks outside of this fella Angel, who's come up a little bit. But any sense of why there is so little interest at this stage? Because we've only got a couple of months to go until the election.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. We didn't probe in terms of the questions, but if you press on the data a little bit, if you go and focus, say, regionally, you'll find that numbers do shift. So, for example, a lot more people in the Baton Rouge area know who Jay Darden is than know him statewide. And similar with Scott Angel in the southwestern part of the state, which suggests that people that have a longer experience with these guys do recognize them. So I think what's going on is exactly what you said. The campaign hasn't reached people yet. A lot of money's not being spent yet. So you have candidates who are just not well known, an open seat race, a governor's race. These numbers are going to change. People are going to start paying attention, but so far it's not in front of their face yet, so they're not thinking about it yet.
So Senator David Vitter just launched his TV commercial, his first TV commercial today. I haven't seen it, but I'm assuming that it's a very positive statement on his part in terms of who he is and what he wants for the state. At the same time, according to your poll, the outlook, I mean, people are very pessimistic about the future of Louisiana. And yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That was actually more of a surprise than the fact that people haven't really tuned in yet, is that we saw a big flip in the percent of people who say the state's heading in the wrong direction since we last asked that in January. A big increase, and it's up to like 59% or whatnot that say the state's heading in the wrong direction. What's really interesting about that, though, is we see an increase, different sizes, but we see an increase among all our partisan groups, Democrats, Republicans, Independents. Among all of those, more of them are saying state's heading in a wrong direction today than said it back in January.
And I might jump in, Steve, because I looked at that question and said, gosh, what a pretty significant drop since January. You say, well, what the heck could have happened? Why are people changing? There's been some things going on in the state and nationally that I think play into that. for example, the state fiscal outlook. Nobody realized what a big crisis the fiscal outlook was, and all of a sudden in March, April, May, the legislature fighting it out, having to raise some taxes despite what the governor says they were tax increases. And I think a lot of people were kind of hit by the side, weren't ready to think it was that bad. And actually, the press day after day told us how bad it was, number one. And then Jindal's unpopularity, I think, really crystallized more as all of these national polls started coming out. And they're saying, gosh, he spent years away from us taking care of our business, and now all of a sudden, for what? And I think that his unpopularity since helped fix that whole mood. And I think the national presidential election, nobody has really caught on outside of Donald Trump, and he's completely off the wall, and Democrats and Republicans alike, people don't have a real good sense of the national mood. So you put all that together, and I'd like to hear what the doc has to say. But Michael, that's my thought of combination of those factors kind of build in a higher negative than you found, say, 6 or 8 months ago.
Yeah, I think that's right on all fronts. Because it's a governor's race at a time when, it's not in Louisiana, as you know, our elections are not on the same cycle. So it's happening during the beginnings of a national primary rather than at the same time as a general election. And so it's harder to sort of connect your mood about the state to your mood about the nation and national politics, except, or unless you turn to the Republican primary, and you're not going to get a strong signal there unless you're using your attitudes towards Governor Jindal as a proxy. And if you are, that would help explain why the numbers are where they are. I suspect the legislative session, the fiscal crisis, had a lot to do with it. When we asked about this back in January, we also asked a few questions about what people understood about the fiscal situation in Louisiana, and it turned out that a lot of people just didn't know, didn't have a real clue about it back in January. My guess is, just as Jim said, when this became an issue that was discussed more prominently, they experienced it as they saw the legislature, their attitudes changed.
Well, given that at this point in time, they are so negative, and I'm sure probably the price of oil has something to do with that too, because there's that risk, the fear factor of losing jobs. But there's probably a whole bunch of reasons. But given how deep, 59%, how does that normally compare to other numbers? I think you said 9 points, I believe, but what is the level of I guess normalcy?
Yeah, they fluctuate from year to year to year, and they tend to follow a cycle over the course of a governor's administration. They tend to be higher when a new governor takes office, and then come down some afterwards. The last several years, so a few years ago, they were high. Interestingly, not as high as they are now. The negatives are not as high as they are now. But what we saw over the last 2 or 3 years is a closing of the gap. Mood was starting to improve, and then by January they were almost neck and neck, right direction, wrong direction. So that had been the trend in the state, is sort of a trend back towards, like, people were becoming slowly, but becoming more optimistic. And then bam, the last 6 months undid all the progress of the last 3 years.